everyone. Welcome to another live stream by podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Brad H. Young. And today we'll be discussing Jesus and his Jewish parables. So this is his book right here. I'll have the link to purchase his book in the description below and in the pinned comment. So the material in the stream is based on his book, but we're going to be primarily talking about Lukan priority and why Dr. Brad Young believes in Lukan priority. The sources that he thinks existed prior to Luke, we're going to get into all that. And another thing I do want to ask about is that does the priority of Luke alter how one understands the historical Jesus? And that being said, thank you for joining me today, Brad.
Thank you, Jacob. It's good to be with you again.
Yeah, thank you for coming back. So I'm going to start us off with this slide right here. So I feel like it's important that we look at the diagram first before we get straight into the meat of it, the more complicated evidence for it. So, Brad, can you tell everybody what's happening in this diagram? What are these sources over here that predate Luke? And take it from there.
Well, I think one of the most important sources is the first one that we see, where we talk about this Hebrew story of Jesus. And there is actually quite a lot of evidence from the early church leaders who are writing, the fathers, the scholars, historians. Eusebius, the great historian, he collected various sayings, earlier teachings. Papias, who said that Matthew wrote the sayings of Jesus in Hebrew, and everyone was translated and interpreted them as he is able. We have similar sayings, teachings to Irenaeus. A recent book that came out by James Edwards called The Hebrew Gospel goes through many of these patristic witnesses. I think he deals with 13 or there's more than 13, but we have this evidence now. People say, well, that's 20. Just the theory.
There's 20.
There's 20. That's just the theory. But I would say more important than these church traditions is the fact that when we read the Greek of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we sense that we're not just reading a composition that was originally written in Greek, but we hear Semitic idioms. We see the syntax, how the sentence is put together, words and phrases that really are Semitic. Now, many of the scholars have argued that it's Aramaic. Aramaic and Hebrew are similar, and probably a lot of the arguments that we would make for Hebrew would also be true in Aramaic. I tend to believe, though, that it was probably more likely written in Hebrew because, for one thing, all the Dead Sea Scrolls, when they're having holy books, they're written in Hebrew at the time. And I think there's a lot of evidence for Mishnaic Hebrew, as the great grammarian, who wrote the Mishnaic grammar, Siegel, wrote. And we've got some other evidence for that. But really, I think a lot of things, if it's Hebrew or Aramaic, you can kind of think about. But we have this evidence for a Semitic text behind the Greek Gospels. And at some point in that tradition, it says it was translated literally into Greek. So here we've got the story of Jesus' life. And I think that that's one of the things that really helps us understand it. Now, Dr. Lindsay in Jerusalem, who worked a lot with translation and worked with David Flusser, Lindsay was tasked with translating the New Testament from Greek into Hebrew, and he completed his work on the Gospel of Mark that was published. And when he was doing this translation, he began to question some of the traditional approaches to the synoptic problem, which argued that Mark was the original gospel. It's the earliest gospel. And one of the things that tipped him off was this Hebrew background, because if Mark was first and Luke, let's say, was last, then you wouldn't see as many Hebrew idioms or Semitic influence in the Greek in Mark's text that you would see in Luke, and Luke would be more Greek. And as he's translating it and working very carefully with the synopsis, comparing Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the three synoptic gospels together, he began to see that Mark sometimes would have more of a Greek idiomatic saying, and Luke would be more Hebraic, and Matthew would often be more Hebraic. And so he began to question this. He also was looking at the order of the Gospels. There seems to be an outline of Jesus' life. We know we've got 3 trips to Jerusalem. We have a collection of parables in Matthew chapter 7. We've got these 2 birth narratives, very powerful, in Luke and Matthew, and they're different from each other. But you kind of see there's an anthology of Jesus' life. And it doesn't seem to be quite in order. Sometimes they agree on order. There's some parts that they agree on, but other parts there's a difference in order. There's this travel narrative in Luke on the way to Jerusalem where Jesus is on a different path than what we see in some of the other Gospels. So these are some of our backgrounds that get that. Then we have the Gospel writers taking these passages and putting them together in an outline for Jesus' life. We feel like that after this anthology, there might have been another kind of shortened version of this that we call a redacted text. It's kind of been edited a little bit. It's really not what we would call a proto-Mark, but we call it the first reconstruction. Now, Luke was using this original anthology. He's also using this first reconstruction. And he's putting his gospel together. Matthew, I think, is really important to look at. He's also using the anthology. And when Matthew and Luke are using that anthology together, they have a very close identity and wording. I would give you an example from the Sermon on the Mount, let's say, where Jesus says, look at the birds of the air. God takes care of them. How much more will he take care of you? And when you compare that passage in Matthew chapter 6 with Luke, let me make sure I get the right track, chapter 12, Luke 12, 22 through 32, Mark 6, 25 through 34, you see a high identity in wording between them. And I think what you would see in looking at the editorial changes in Luke is that he's kind of stylizing it a little bit more in Greek, but both of them are exceptionally Hebraic. There we don't have any Markan parallel at all. So, that's important, I think, when we see some of this double tradition. Now, if you notice, we do not have Matthew knowing this first reconstruction. And so we have a text like the Lord's Prayer in Matthew chapter 6. I would say the Lord's Prayer in Matthew chapter 6 is very Hebraic. You see the language, the structure of the prayer. 7 petitions begins with our Father who art in heaven. We have many Hebrew prayers that begin that way. We have this, forgive us our sins, for we also have forgiven those who have sinned against us or offended us or wronged us. Where Luke has Father and he has the present tense. It's not, it's been stylized a little bit. Well, I would argue that Luke is quoting from the first reconstruction. And that first reconstruction, the idiom is not quite as what we call Semitic and showing the Hebrew undertext. And when Luke is using that text, many times we see Matthew better represents the anthology, the Hebrew anthology, the literal translation from Hebrew into Greek. So that's very important. Now, what we find when we look at Mark's gospel is that Dr. Lindsay believed that Mark was new Luke. He also is sometimes using this anthology. I like the way David Bibbin talked about it. Who's one of the great students of Dr. Lindsay in Synoptic Studies, and has a lot of articles in their special website, the Jerusalem Perspective. A lot of scholars have written about this, but he saw Mark as kind of a Targumist. Now, Targum is the Hebrew word that we usually refer to for the Aramaic translation of the Hebrew scriptures. But Targum just means translation. But the Targumist, when they translated the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic, sometimes they would add a little color, story, narrative, and there it's maybe a way to say it. he was a preacher writer, so sometimes he's giving a little bit more for his audience. And so I think this is really important when we look at this. One thing I would point out when we look at this, Jacob, is that, there's a lot of different theories about the synoptic problem. I like this new book by John Wenham. Well, it's not sold. It's been out a while. But he worked with the New Testament studies from Cambridge. They had a symposium on the Synoptic Gospels where New Testament scholars were gathering and talking. And he said, on the collapse of consensus, Wenham observed, I have found in the Synoptic Problem seminar for the Society for New Testament Studies whose members were in disagreement over every aspect of the subject. When this international group disbanded in 1982, they had sadly to confess that after 12 years' work, they had not reached a common mind on a single issue. Kind of shocking. I don't know if you've been reading work on the Synoptic Gospels, you understand that there's a lot of controversy about this. And many times people don't agree. Wenham himself kind of went in the direction of the Augustinian approach and believed that Matthew was the first gospel. Today, the strongest opinion is that Mark is the first. I would recommend that people study the book of Hans Herbert Stolt on the history and criticism of the Markan hypothesis and how it kind of developed. But I think what I would say about the scholars who have been working with the Jerusalem School and the collaboration between Robert Lindsay and David Flusser at the Hebrew University, a Christian scholar, a Jewish scholar, evangelical, Orthodox, working together on the life of Jesus, is that really they've seen these sources. And I really think you can go through the Gospels and see which one of these sources comes from the first reconstruction, comes from the anthology, and we can see the way that these Gospels interacted with one another. And Dr. Lindsay felt like that Luke was first. David Flusser agreed with this. I think also on the dating of the Gospels. I remember in one of Dr. Flusser's books that he wrote in Hebrew, Yadutu Mekorot HaNatzrut, very important book. But he says there's nothing in the three Gospels that would make us think that they were written after 70. So it's interesting that this Orthodox Jewish scholar is dating the Gospels earlier than some of the other scholars. I would note that Wenham also is arguing for an early dating of the Gospels. This is another issue that we're dealing with. I mean, there are some hints and allusions to the destruction of Jerusalem, which might be redactional, or also we see prophetic. There were prophets mentioned, Jewish prophets mentioned in Josephus who were prophesying the destruction of the temple. There was corruption, and people felt like something was going to give. So, but I would say David Bevan, Randall Booth, David Flusser, Bob Lindsay. You kind of see this synopsis approach where we can get together. I know David Bevan and I used to study privately with Dr. Lindsay, just going through these different texts. And it was very helpful for me as I was working on my doctorate, writing on the parables of Jesus, writing a subsequent book, a couple of books on the parables, where we were putting it together. Of course, Jesus and his Jewish parables really deal with this issue of the synoptic problem, how and why it makes a difference when we're studying the synoptic Gospels to understand the interconnections between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and how this approach where we emphasize Mark so much has sometimes been misleading.
So I want to go back to the diagram for a moment. How exactly does it work in the process of reconstructing these pre-Lucan sources? And what makes you think that Matthew had no contact with Luke? Why is it that it kind of, in some sense, would it be fair if I compared it in some sense to the two source theory? Because in a way, like the two source theory, Matthew and Luke are independent of each other. And Mark is kind of like the instead of being the primary, instead of being the first gospel, it's kind of like the middleman instead, separating the two. So can you explain that more?
Yes, let me give you an example. I think one of the texts that people struggle with a lot of times is the question of fasting and the new wine. You know, if you follow Matthew and Mark, they're very close in their wording of the cloth. You take a new cloth, you sew it in to an older garment. The new cloth shrinks, tears the garment, but you can't put new wine into old wineskins. They were burst. And you end the whole story is that the new wine is best. However, when we look at it in Luke, you know, it might be good. I'll just look at it here, even in our new translation, which I think would help a little bit. In Luke 5:39, well, let's start a little earlier. No one makes a patch to sew on an old garment by tearing a new garment. If he does, the new garment will have been torn, and the fabric of the new patch will not match the old garment. No one, moreover, pours new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the new wine will burst the old wineskins. The wine will be spilled out, and the wineskins destroyed. New wine must be poured into fresh wineskins. No one, after drinking old wine, desires new. He says, the old is better. I think that's really amazing. Verse 39, where in Luke's version it says, the new wine is not as good as the old wine. The old wine is better. The Greek term is krestos, which is kind of, it's very superior. In Hebrew, we might even say meshupar in modern Hebrew. In some manuscripts, it really emphasizes the old wine is better. And what we see here is that when Jesus is talking about the fasting, well, the Pharisees have these additional fasts. They fast on Tuesdays and Thursdays. We see in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector praying. The Pharisee says, I fast twice a week. In the Jewish Christian document of the Didache, we see this discussed, fasting. And they were introducing innovative fast. There are biblical fasts, of course. We think first and foremost of the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, as a fast. And so why aren't Jesus' disciples fasting? Excuse me. And why don't they have the fast of John the Baptist and the Pharisees, additional fasts? I think it's very clear that when you have an additional fast like this, excuse me, it's for spiritual renewal. The Pharisees had a good reason for fasting. John the Baptist, fasting is a part of repentance, repenting. And it seems like Jesus is saying the old wine is better. It's sufficient, the foundational fast, and his disciples aren't fasting. The bridegroom is still with them. But if you read the parallel versions in Mark, he's revised it, and Matthew has pretty much copied him, and there's no mention of the old wine is better at the end. I think that part of this is maybe a feeling of antipathy towards the faith of the Jewish people in the Hebrew scriptures, the Jewish faith at the time. And we have to remember that Jesus emphasized, do not think that I've come to destroy the law and the prophets. I've come to fulfill them. And I think he had a high value of the Jewish faith and practice as it was being practiced at the time. But when you get to a subsequent level in Christian involvement with the teachings of Jesus and the Judaism of the time, there was a tendency to see Christianity as a refutation of the old law. And the new wine is changing everything. But when we look at what we see in the Gospels here, when he says the old wine is better, it seems to reflect more of the tradition that we know from the foundation of the Gospels, the earlier tradition that sees Jesus reforming Jewish faith and practice, bringing revitalization of Jewish faith and practice, rather than starting a new religion. I think some of the Jewish parallels, David Flusser wrote an article about this, brought out some excellent parallels that helps us understand it better. There is a parallel that we see in Sifrei Dvarim. This is the oldest commentary in Jewish faith and practice on the book of Deuteronomy, and that comes from the time of the Mishnah, maybe even before. It says, talking about the old wine and how important it is in representing Jewish faith and practice, it makes this statement: one does not feel the taste of the wine at the beginning, but the longer it grows old in the pitcher, the better it becomes. So also the words of Torah, the longer they grow old in the body, the better they become. So words of Torah are compared to the words of the Bible, and wine, and the older wine, the aged wine is better. And let's face it, almost everybody would say, well, the aged wine, older wine, is thought to be better than the new wine. So, if you're going to understand the parable better, I think Jesus is saying, well, these fasts are okay, but really, we can be renewed. We need a people renewed for the new wine. So I think when we look at these gospel passages together, for instance, if you look at the way that Matthew and Mark follow each other, they kind of change the story, the parable of the cloth. No one puts a new piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. They follow that almost exactly. And they end with saying, new wine is put into fresh wineskins, so both are preserved. And they don't have the final conclusion of that saying. And I think that might even be, some people have thought that this might even be a reaction to, from Marcion, a little bit of influence. Marcion had a copy of Luke. He took out that verse in Luke 5:39. He did not allow the verse, the old wine is better. It changed some of the meaning. But you can see in the discussion. So you're asking the question, why didn't Matthew know Luke? Well, I think this is the example. What I would give as the answer, because this is what we sometimes refer to as the Mark and cross factor. What we see is that different authors, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, deal with the sources a little bit differently. Luke, when he's dealing with the ontology, sometimes he has word that he wants to make clearer. He doesn't like to use kingdom of heavens, kingdom of the heavens. He prefers kingdom of God. And so he prefers heavenly Father sometimes instead of our Father who art in heaven. David Flusser felt like this might be a certain approach because of the Greek idea that Zeus is in heavens, and they didn't want to confuse who God is, and so he's making some adjustments there. Whereas Matthew, what does Matthew do? He's very careful to quote his sources, and so when he's quoting the ontology, he is often more meticulous, and so the ontology appears more Hebraic. And when he's quoting Mark, when he sees that Mark has been editing it, in this case, he's editing the story. Mark is dealing a little bit with preacher writer, dealing a little bit with the cloth shrinking and the new wine, and he just kind of stops short on saying, well, the old wine is better. He just doesn't say that. Matthew is like, he deals with the ontology where he quotes it more exactly. He quotes Mark more exactly, and he feels like Mark, who's a little bit more of the preacher writer, is making good changes. So he incorporates that into his gospel text. So when we study all three better together, we can see Well, here is Luke's version. It's a little more Hebraic. It's a little more connected to the anthology. Mark has made some adjustments. And Matthew, because he's quoting Mark on this passage, follows Mark's writing. And we don't see Matthew using Luke's innovations, the things that bother Luke a little bit. I don't know if bothering is right. I mean, I think from a standpoint of faith, we see, this type of editing process is guided by the Spirit. But I think when we look at the inspiration of the Bible, we have to realize, just as when Paul is writing to Timothy, or the pastoral epistles, if we see those as Pauline, that he's saying all Scripture is given by inspiration of God. Well, Scripture is a way literature, so we're studying it. We're going deeper into the detail of the sources and how they use those sources. And I think in that way, we get a clearer picture of Jesus in the Jewish context, the Hebraic context. And we also see how that Matthew and Mark may be developing this message to communicate it more effective to their communities and their audiences. That when we're wanting to get as far back as we can to the Hebrew sayings, I think it's very important to understand this interconnection between the gospel writers. And in this particular case, I think when we see the connection to the aged wine and the foundation of our faith, I didn't come to destroy the law and the prophets. I came to fulfill them. I'm interpreting them. I'm using them properly. And he didn't want to necessarily fast like John the Baptist or like the Pharisees. That would kind of be adopting everything John the Baptist and the Pharisees are saying. But he says there will come a time when they will fast, when the bridegroom is taken away from them. And they may have innovative fast. I know some have seen in the Sermon on the Mount, when you fast, that Jesus was giving instructions for when his disciples might fast privately. Maybe there were times that they were fasting, praying for different issues. Jesus said at one point, this kind does not come out except by prayer and fasting and forcing out this evil, this demonic entity. And the disciples failed, and he talked about faith and prayer. So, but, I think when he's talking about instituting these fasts as a new approach, he's emphasizing primarily that the fast that we have in the Hebrew Scriptures. I mean, there are many fasts in Jewish tradition at the time that go beyond the, just Yom Kippur. And we have a reference in Zechariah that there will be a time that the fast will be turned not in the times of mournings, but to times of exaltation and praise. And so there's a lot of interaction about fasting sometimes in a drought, prayers of the community. But in general, Jesus is saying the foundation of Jewish faith and practice is strong, and we need new people renewed for the best of the old wine. So I think that's a little difference, maybe a difference between John the Baptist and Jesus. John the Baptist and Jesus were very close to one another, according to the gospel stories. John the Baptist was preparing the way for the coming of Jesus, and his call to the baptism is a baptism of repentance. Repentance often is connected with fasting, so it wouldn't be surprising that his disciples are fasting. We know that the Pharisees were very dedicated in prayer and fasting, and sometimes that created a situation where someone might have hypocrisy. We see that in the parable that Jesus kind of portrays in the publican and the tax collector and the Pharisee praying together at the temple, kind of shocking this contrast between two individuals. Of course, in the time, they thought of the Pharisee as someone holy, and Jesus himself says that the scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, do what they say. So he felt like there were many good teachings that the Pharisees were giving. We even see in Luke's gospel, I think, another aspect that shows an early date, early understanding of the complexity, the multi-layered stratum of Jewish society and religious leaders and tradition at the time, that the Pharisees came and warned Jesus in Luke 13:31 that Herod wants to kill you. And obviously, this shows you the Pharisees in a positive light, that they were trying to rescue Jesus from a death plot. Most people have tried to minimize that, and they just look at the Pharisees as hypocrites. And you have to remember that Jesus was upholding the teachings and the spiritual disciplines of the Pharisees, at the same time saying that there are some of them who preach well, but they don't practice. So it's a difference between criticizing Pharisaism entirely and saying that there are hypocritical practices among some Pharisees. I think another example where you see, a positive view of the Pharisees in Luke's writing comes later in the book of Acts, where the leader of the Pharisees, Ramban Gamaliel Hazaken, we know him from the rabbinic literature. He says to those coming from the priestly, the Sadducees, where I think we see maybe a little more resistance, a little more opposition to what Jesus is saying, and they're persecuting the apostles. And Gamaliel says in Acts chapter 5, we've got to be careful. We might be fighting against God. This man might be the leader, and he talks about there's been some that have been proven to be false leaders, but we don't know that about Jesus yet. We need to give more time to it. And he actually saves the lives of the apostles, the leader of the Pharisees, taking up for the leaders of the early Jesus movement, the believers in the early church. So, again, I think we see maybe a little bit more of the more intimate knowledge from the sources being reflected in Luke's writings, whereas we're generally putting them later, where maybe they're earlier. And so with Lindsay, he began to see this from his translation work, and then he began to study the sources. And when you look at the linguistic background of the sources, I think it's very clear to see these sources where Luke and Matthew, when they're by themselves, and they're both quoting from the anthology, they have a high identity in wording together. And it's very Hebraic, and usually Matthew's a little more Hebraic. And then when Luke is quoting from the first reconstruction, his wording may be more influenced by Greek editing and thought, and maybe it's shortened a little bit, and Matthew's version may be a little bit differently. But when they have Mark influences Matthew. And so Luke is closer to the Greek anthology, and Matthew is closer to Mark, and Matthew is carefully quoting his sources.
So now I want to get into Markan expansion. So we get to the next slide. So here you talk about where, and this is on page 140 in your book, the scribes already mentioned in Mark 9:11 and Matthew 17:10, while Luke records that the crowds were astonished after Jesus performed the miracle in Luke 9:43. So can you tell us what's going on here? What exactly is Mark expanding here?
If we look at Mark 9:11, he goes a little more into detail with more adjectives describing the praise, adoration. We see sometimes he describes a little bit more the activity of someone that's troubled by a demon. Oh, he throws him into the fire, and maybe Matthew and Luke don't have that emphasis. But on page 140 of the book, I was talking here about Mark 9:11, which is paralleled. And let's see here. I always like to see exactly Mark 9:11 and Matthew 17:10. While Luke records that the crowds were astonished after Jesus performed the miracle. Luke 9:43. See if we go down here to Luke 9:43, where we see the text. You can see that there's quite an expansion in Mark 19. You'll see this And Jesus asked the Father, how long has he been like this? From childhood. Mark adds this idea that brought the boy to him. When the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground, rolled about, foaming at the mouth. See, this is quite an expansion and a description. And so he says, the man says, if you can, all things are possible to him who believes. You know, you have a little bit more of this description. You also see the reference here to the fact that the man is trying to believe, and the Jesus is helping. It's a very powerful story, but if you read the version in Luke 9:37 through 43, it's much shorter. It just says the demon tore him and convulsed him, but Mark has he's fell on the ground, rolled about, foaming at the mouth, and Matthew 17:14 is a little shorter. Oh, faithless and perverse generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear you? He's talking about the disciples who were unable to deliver this boy. This is a very beautiful story of a healing in the Gospels where the disciples were unable, even though the disciples had gone on this healing mission and they had a lot of success. We hear Jesus praising them. Then when this man brought this particularly difficult case of his boy, they were unable to help him. And so the man goes into the details. So it's one of these major expansions in Mark's gospel. And Mark, this particular pericope, this story unit in the Gospels, Mark 9:14 through 21. The end of the story is very powerful in Mark. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had entered the house, the disciples asked him privately, why could we not cast it out? And he said to them, this kind does not go back. This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. Now, some manuscripts add prayer and fasting. So probably the better manuscripts just talk about prayer. So, but that's an example of a Markan expansion. And in this case, Matthew does not follow that. And so, I think when we could study Matthew and Mark, look at them, compare them with the Greek ontology, Hebraically, try to see how they're connecting together. But one of the things I think, if we just go back to what John Wenham is saying, that, there's a little consensus sometimes. You can get the two document hypothesis, and people can explain different aspects of the gospel tradition. But I found it was so exciting to work with that linguistic understanding where we're looking at the Hebraism and how a particular Greek text could be reconstructed. I mean, you can translate back into Hebrew, but sometimes when you see the Hebrew idioms, you might even be able to do a little bit better of a reconstruction. I think when we read in the Sermon on the Mount, this passage I referred to earlier, he says, you have bread in your basket today. What are we going to eat tomorrow? What are we going to eat? What are we going to wear? He says, oh, you of little faith. And, we have this exact same phrase. We have a very close parallel in Mishnaic Hebrew where it says, if he who has bread in his basket today and says, what shall I eat tomorrow? Behold, he is of little faith. Well, one way you might translate it is machusare amana, which we have in the Mechilta. But then when we go to the Talmudic passage, which is later, but it may be quoting an early source, it also has the idea katanei amana. So one is lacking faith, the other is of little faith. But in the better parallel, we get this exact phrase in Hebrew, katanei amana. So there we've got the little faith, or katanei emunah, but amanah may have been the way that they said faith. Today we usually use the word emunah. But again, once you start looking at these Hebraic sources, the Dead Sea Scrolls are a great help for this. I say a source like Sirach bin Sirah. We have very good Hebrew from the, maybe 140 BC, 130. This later biblical Hebrew, later biblical books or Hebrew leading up into the time of Christ. But then we also have this literature, Mishnaic Hebrew, from a little bit later, but also showing these early Hebrew idioms. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls. They had a lot of documents that they were writing for their own benefit of the group, in Hebrew. And some people feel like it's a little bit of a literary Hebrew. It's a little different, but it's definitely Hebrew from the time period. So all of these things can help us when we're studying the Gospels. I wish we had, maybe someday we'll discover some Hebrew documents from the caves that we can verify definitely that they come from this time. That might help us understand a little bit better the type of Hebrew. Now, I'll be surprised if it's Aramaic. I know somebody else might be surprised if it's Hebrew and not Aramaic. And of course, one of the problems is with Aramaic is what kind of Aramaic, if you're talking about Aramaic. And do we have Eastern Aramaic? And, there's a lot that we could discuss with what they're using to talk about the Aramaic in the Gospels. Sometimes some of the early scholars, especially like C.C. Torrey, Gustav Dalman, they like to use the Aramaic Targums. But, you really can't use a Targum where you're translating the Bible from Hebrew into Aramaic as the living language. I mean, I could use the same thing. I can find the idioms in the original Hebrew Bible sometimes better than just looking at the Aramaic Targums. But there's sometimes the expansions where they're using it. Targum Neophiti, sometimes it's thought to be a little bit better in some of the expansions. So this is a very complex linguistic question. But I do think whether you believe it's the Semitic language behind the Gospels is Hebrew or Aramaic, the principle is the same because you can recognize the Semitic nature of the Greek text. It's very different from some of the other Greek texts that we have from the time. And I think it really helps us, when we're studying New Testament Greek, to read other types of Greek. Sometimes New Testament scholars, we learn to read the Greek New Testament, but it's good to read other Greek literature of the time and to see the beautiful Greek language. And it's so powerful in Greek, but I think when we look at it in that Hebrew dimension, we get a better sense of the force and the delivery and the authenticity of the message than when we just read it in Greek or think about it in the English translation of the Greek.
All right, so now we're in Figure 1, page 149. You talk about the variations of agreement between Matthew and Mark. So to tell us what's going on here, like what are these variations? I think the minor agreements are also playing a role here, if I remember correctly.
Yes, the minor agreements are so powerful because what you'll see when you look at Matthew 4:23, Mark 1:39, Luke 4:44 is sometimes there will be an agreement in wording that is between Matthew and Luke against Mark. So if you look at the way that texts are written, if you accept the Markan hypothesis that Mark is written first and then Matthew and Luke are copying Mark, well, you expect the text to look like Mark when they're copying Mark. But what if they, make a little change someplace? Matthew would make a change apart from Luke, and Luke might make a change. But what we find is that many of these agreements is that Matthew and Luke use the exact same word to change the text of Mark. So if they use the exact same word to change the text of Mark, the thought would be is that they're either copying from one another or they have a common source. So, our understanding of this is that at that point, both Matthew and Luke are using the ontology text. Mark is changing the wording a little bit in the ontology text. And then Matthew is not copying from Mark, so he's agreeing with Luke. So it's kind of a proof that there's a connection between Matthew and Luke apart from Mark. But if you're in the two document hypothesis world, that Mark and Q, we haven't talked about Q. I think most people already know about Q, but Q, means the word is the German word Quella, which means a source or, spring of water. And what the two document hypothesis argues is that there was a document called the Q document, and they take all the passages from Matthew and Luke that they have in common apart from Mark, and they say that's a special source. I mean, that's not a bad conclusion just looking at the evidence, but I think it's a lot more complicated when we start going into the details and we do careful linguistic analysis. And that's one of the things that really impressed me when I was working on my doctorate and teaching and living in Israel, working with Flusser and working with Lindsay and so many other great scholars, kind of taking this approach. Some might, approach it a little bit differently, different nuances. But, what I saw is that, these scholars were really, especially Lindsay, he's really doing almost like a biology class dissection, studying the wording, dissecting the wording. And when you're translating something, when you translate a document from Greek into Hebrew, you learn a lot from just translating it. And I know in my own experience working on the translation of the Newer Testament, it just opened my eyes so much, just translating the Synoptic Gospels, translating the whole New Testament, translating the book of Revelation. I mean, you see, if you know Hebrew really well and you know Greek really well, you'll see the difference between Greek and Hebrew in these texts, and you can draw them together. So you can see there are variations, sometimes variations in order, variations in the way that they're coming together like that. So I really like your questions. We've got to look at the text more. The text is what teaches us. I mean, I love the fact that we got all these church traditions and, Papias, Irenaeus. I mean, they saw the Hebrew gospel, but the fact that the Greek text itself shows us, they said, well, where is it? I think it's right here in our text. If you know Greek and you know Hebrew very well, you can read and reconstruct the Hebrew text and understand better the Greek text from the Hebrew side. And of course, the Greek is a canonical text. So there's no way that we're trying to marginalize in any way the Greek text, but you want to study the Greek text with all the sources that you have. And we have these linguistic sources in Hebrew and the Hebrew of the time and the Bible, the Sifra, the Mechilta, the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are rich resources, whether it's Ben Sira, these are rich resources to learn a little bit more of the Hebrew of the time and to hear the story. I mean, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are telling us the most powerful story, and they're using the best tools that they have. I think one of the texts you have to keep in mind is how Luke, in the introduction, is describing how he compiled the Gospels. I know we recently had a wonderful lecture at the Ecumenical Theological Research Fraternity in Israel with Father Cristobal, who just worked on the Benedictus in Luke's Gospel, where the father of Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, is giving this powerful prayer. And it's paralleled in the prayers of the Amidah, the 18 benedictions that we talk about, the prayer for the horn of salvation. And Father Cristobal sees this in some of the other prayers of the 18 benedictions. It's very powerful, his work. But he tends to see the Gospels Luke as being a writer of all these sources. And I think other scholars, I mean, I would kind of put myself in this standpoint of the other scholars. I tend to see that Luke is using a source, because the introduction to the Gospels, he says, well, many have tried to write, and we have all these sources. We have eyewitnesses. Maybe that Luke talked with Mary, the mother of Jesus, or maybe there are some aspects that he's developing from oral traditions. But what we saw in our study of the Gospels, it seems to be more of a literary connection. But certainly the first two chapters of Luke and the Benedictus are very Hebraic, and the connections to prayer are very powerful. Yehuda Libas, also, I think in the 80s, he published an article in Hebrew talking about the Benedictus and the 14th benediction of the prayers, and he saw a literary connection. I don't know if there's a direct literary connection. Maybe they come from the same root. We also have parallels to this prayer in Ben Sira and other parts of the Bible. So, but one thing we do see is it's very Hebraic, and it's not so important to see if one prayer is influencing the other, but to hear the prayer for salvation, for the power, the care in Yeshua, the flourishing of the salvation. So it's very powerful prayer. But again, sometimes the Hebrew parallels, and I personally feel like we have not explored enough in our trajectory of scholarship to probe a little bit deeper into the Hebrew sources, rabbinic literature, which sometimes scholars want to call later literature. I mean, that people aren't really working with the dating accurately scientifically. They're kind of dismissing it, but even some later texts might influence, and because they have earlier sources that they're quoting, that could help us with first century studies as well. And I think people recognize this more in the Dead Sea Scrolls than they do in studying the New Testament today. I remember the fine article of Samuel Sandmill, which when he was president of the Society of Biblical Literature, is a great day that this wonderful Jewish scholar who's contributed so much to understanding Second Temple period Judaism and works so much with other scholars, and he was president of the Society of Biblical Literature. I think it was that year that he wrote this article about parallelomania, where you might try to force a parallel. You're not studying the context. I don't think he was ever saying you shouldn't study these things, but sometimes people have quoted that commentaries that do an associative comparative study between rabbinic literature and the New Testament are guilty of parallelomania. I would also point out this wonderful scholar, Solomon Schechter, who earlier, commented about so many German higher critics, Wellhausen, sometimes who criticize rabbinic literature, and they said they don't even need to study it. It has no purpose. They kind of dismissed, the Jewish faith of the time. And I liked what he said. Well, to do that, you're just trapped in transcendental ignorance. At that point, transcendental ignorance that Solomon Schechter used is pertinent even today, that we don't want to go deeper in studying the sources, knowing the lives of the scholars, the attributions, examining them. Are they accurate? Are they good? And, doing more of a comparative study. We really need to understand the whole faith culture of the time. There were many approaches, but Jesus was a part of that religious environment. I think it's very powerful that he would say, the old wine is better, or that he would say, I did not come to destroy the law and the prophets, I came to fulfill. And this word to fulfill means to interpret, to understand the deeper spiritual meaning and the practical application. And the study of the Synoptic Gospels shows us this development, where you start out with Jesus affirming the faith and practice of the Jewish people, and then it's kind of being weakened a little bit in the parallel source in the case of the old wine and Mark, and then also paralleled in Matthew. And so we can see a development there that might help us appreciate the synoptic problem as well. But I think the linguistic experience of Bob Lindsay and his translation work, also the way that we see that Matthew dealt with his sources, and sometimes he follows Mark very closely, sometimes he's following the anthology very closely. And then we also see that while Luke often is following that anthology very closely, he also has this first reconstruction that sometimes is a little bit different. But we can piece together these sources of the Gospels, and you can see Matthew's unique traditions. He has unique traditions about the birth of Jesus, the flight into Egypt, the dreams of Joseph, really showing us a lot of the things in Joseph's domain. And we have Luke, which his first two chapters, the birth of Jesus, the shepherds, and it's very, very Hebraic, and it gives you a little bit more of Mary's perspectives. So this is also important in the way that we study the trial of Jesus, the resurrection narratives. But I think understanding this interconnection between the synoptic gospels opens up the life of Jesus in a very meaningful way. And one aspect of this I think is important that we see is that it's the faith of Jesus that strengthens and authenticates the faith in Jesus. And for too many times, I think people have kind of looked at the Christianity as kind of a refutation of the old and bringing in a new that replaces the old. But what we see is it's an affirmation of the old that takes the newer in a more positive direction, and in a practical faith, discipleship, and Christian and experience, spiritual experience.
So now we're on the next slide, in which you show additional variations in arrangement.
Yes, this shows you a little bit of what we call the argument of order that the Karl Lachmann, who was a great German theologian, exegete, I think in the 19th century, he's working, and he felt like that Mark pretty much determined the order of the life of Jesus, and that Matthew and Luke were following his order. But when we begin to look at it, there are variations in the arrangement of the Gospels. And so I think, and one scholar, I remember we were discussing this with others, but when you have an argument of order, the order goes every way you want it to, and if you have one that's shorter, like Mark is shorter in chapters, it's going to appear, whether it's true or not, that he's the actual order, but it doesn't really prove anything. But and I like the way, E.P. Sanders wrote a book on the tendencies of a synoptic problem. And, he dealt with a lot of these issues. And you can look at this area of the order. But I think when you really look at the facts in themselves, the order is a weaker argument, because Mark could be following Luke, Mark could be following Matthew, he could be following the anthology, and he's shortening it. I think we also see that the writers are sometimes organizing it a little bit differently. I mean, Matthew has 5 major sections, and I think it's likely that he's thinking of the Chamisha Chumshei Torah. It's kind of paralleled in the 5 books of the Pentateuch, and each one ends with, and he finished saying these sayings, or he finished this, and you can kind of see these blocks. He also likes to collect things like parables together. And one reason I think we have variations in order that we see in our synoptic stemma that you originally started with is in the anthology text. It seems like in the first reconstruction, there's a little bit of a difference in order of some of these stories. And then each of the gospel writers senses this, and they rearrange it a little bit. Luke seems to be very aware of this, because he says, writing to Theophilus, I'm trying to explain these things in the order. I think it's more of not like 1, 2, 3 order, but it's more like a sequence of how one event interlocks with another event. And so it's building his story from the birth narrative to the healings, the preaching, healing, calling disciples, healing, and his journey to Jerusalem. And of course, John's gospel, which is not what we consider a synoptic gospel. It's another genre, really giving us more of the theological interpretation of Jesus' life, but also, very important story units that we don't see in the synoptic gospels. Maybe other gospel stories in that anthology that we don't have. We have apocryphal gospels. I don't know. I love every story I can learn about Jesus. I've read the New Testament apocrypha, the Nag Hammadi codices, and all of these are very interesting, and they're statements of faith, religious texts. But I don't really think that they are like the synoptic gospels. I don't believe that the Gospel of Thomas was used by the synoptic gospels. No, I think Thomas was using the synoptic gospels and using them for his purpose. And so, and that stream of thought more in a Gnostic environment, a Gnostic community, whereas, which is not what we see reflected in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But John is very powerful. And he has his three trips to Jerusalem, and that impacts your chronology and the order that you have. So I think these figures that I'm giving in the book and dealing with the synoptic problem, I have a in-depth study of the synoptic problem and Jesus and his Jewish parables to show this interconnection. I'm trying to say that we got to be careful about using the argument of order, with all due honor to Karl Lachmann in the 19th century, that is a proof that Mark is first, because the optic is the shorter gospel looks like it's influencing the others. But the argument of order is not as strong as you would think when you read Karl Lachmann's approach. And I think this is recognized a lot by scholars. I mean, I've talked a little bit about John Wenham. He argues that Matthew was first. Of course, W.R. Farmer was very famous for arguing for Matthean priority. And Augustine, early church leaders looked at Matthew as being first. And maybe they just felt that way from the Lectio, that you're reading this and the readings and emphasizing Matthew a little bit more. But modern scholarship has moved decisively with a consensus of scholarship that Mark is first. And so a few of us that are looking at these, the evidence, to me, the evidence is more important than the theory. So I think the evidence of the argument of order is not conclusive. It's not compelling. It's a part of the overall picture. But we have to go deeper into the multi-layered evidence, linguistic background, minor agreements, mark and cross factor. I think you can see the mark and cross factor in many texts. How do you have a stemma that can represent all of these different sources, the sources behind our synoptic gospels, to get a clearer picture of the historical Jesus?
All right, so we have some more variations of arrangement between Luke and Mark.
Yeah, this is really helpful when you look at this and you look at the argument of order, that you can see Mark and Luke. Luke has quite a bit of difference in the way that he's arranged his gospel. And to me, that's an indication that Luke is independent of Mark. And we also see the wording that Mark is copying from Luke, so that, you begin to understand that a lot better. Luke emphasizes this travel narrative where Jesus goes through Jericho, going up to Jerusalem. And you can see these variations. Luke chapter 11, you can see this in chapter 9. You can see it's a little bit of a variation in Mark. And if you look at these passages, also E.P. Sanders, he has, some of this discussion about the arrangements, variations of arrangement between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Very important aspect of this whole interaction with the synoptic problem. One source I would also recommend, I don't know, I think it's out of print now, but something that kind of helps you see the big picture is the diagram by Alan Barr. And there's other diagrams. I know there's different, you go on the internet, they'll have different diagrams that show these materials, but the diagram of Barr is really good, that it lists all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and it shows the sources and color codes them. And I know that was helpful in our study sometimes as we looked at the order and the interconnection as we're studying the life of Christ and how it's unfolding in Matthew's arrangement and Mark's arrangement and in Luke's arrangement. What I think you do see is that there is a greater collaboration between Mark's order and Matthew's order. And again, to me, that shows the Mark and cross factor, that Mark is influencing Matthew's order a little bit more. I think that might even raise a question of the ending of Mark. Mark, some manuscripts, Mark ends at 9. We have a shorter ending of Mark, emphasizing the proclamation of the gospel throughout the world. Then we have the longer ending of Mark with speaking with new tongues, taking up serpents, casting out demons. Everyone who believes will be saved. Very powerful, longer ending of Mark, and a lot of debate, a lot of books written on the ending of Mark. And in the Newer Testament, where I translated the Mark, I tried to give you actually 3 endings. Most Gospels just give you one. But I'll give you the 3 endings and give you a little bit of information. And another ending, which I think is also a possibility, is that Matthew is copying Mark, and maybe if there was an early copy of Mark that the ending wasn't there, and we look at Matthew's ending, we can see that Matthew is writing the ending of Mark, and it might help us understand a little bit better Mark's ending just by setting Matthew's ending. I don't know if that really explains everything or not, but it certainly helps us. You have the disciples with great fear in Matthew, but we also have the emphasis of preaching to the world, which we see reflected in one of these other endings of Mark. It's kind of hard for me to say that the longer ending of Mark was written by Mark. I think one thing you see is that longer ending reflects early church tradition and the Christian movement. The disciples of Jesus at the time tells us a lot about what was happening at the earliest time of the flourishing of Christian faith and practice is in Mark's longer ending, but it may have been written by somebody else. So, I think it's certainly considered canonical by many, but, the best manuscripts end at verse 9 with the resurrection of the Lord and this sense of awe overwhelming the early community in the Gospel of Mark. But again, this is a part of our variation in arrangement and order and the ending of the Gospels as we have them.
So now we have another slide of the stemma. So basically, what you're getting at is that Mark, the difference between Luke and Matthew, as you said in our prior shows, the difference between Luke and Matthew is Mark.
Yes.
And
so when we look at our stemma proposed by the Jerusalem School, and I think there's a very good article that was written in the Jerusalem Perspective, written after my book by Bob Lindsay. And, and they have a stem. It's pretty much what we have here. But, it's good to see Lindsay. I think it's interesting that we kind of work on this together. And, we can all use this. Several scholars have used variations, but very, very similar to this stemma, that we have the Hebrew Evangelium, meaning this is the proto-gospel, the early gospel of Jesus' life. And then we have a Greek translation of it. It may be that there might have been some problem of order. I mean, this is part of what we're talking about when we talk about this arrangement and of the Gospels, is that some text may not be in there as they were in the original Hebrew proto-evangelium. I mean, I'll give you an example with parables. I think that's important to mention if we're talking about this, is that it seems like Jesus often used twin parables, partner parables, and sometimes they don't appear in the same context. For instance, when we have the lost sheep and the lost coin, well, these are parallel parables and they're together. We have the treasure in the field, and we have the pearl of great price. These are two parallel parables that are in the same place, But when we have the friend at midnight and the widow and the judge, well, in Matthew and Luke, the friend at midnight is in chapter 11, and the widow of the judge is in Luke 18. And it seems like they're parallel partner parables, but they're in different texts. So, I mean, he could have told two different parables, similar in different ways at different times. You can look at it that way. But we're seeing a literary connection. We believe that these were written in a text, and probably originally these two parables were together. So when we go from the Hebrew or Evangelium to the Greek translation, it may be that some of these texts were out of their context when they're translated. Or maybe in this reorganized source text, we've got some things where the order is changing, and then we have this first reconstruction. So once you get into this area of the reorganized source text, there was a desire in this first reconstruction, and that's what we can see is this unique Lucan material that is parallel to Matthew, but has a different wording and has some more changes in it. And you can see all these sources in Luke. It's very easy to see how that comes out in Luke. And then when we go to Mark, we see him rewording this a little bit, the preacher-writer coming out in him. And, of course, the example you pulled from my book, which is a very good one, is of when the disciples were not able to successfully deliver this child, and the father brought his boy, and they weren't able to force out the demon. When he talks about it, he goes on, he fell down, he foams at the mouth. A very graphic description goes on a little bit. And you would think if Matthew and Luke were looking at it, they would give everything. I would say in that case, Matthew is looking at the proto source. I mean, he's looking at the reorganized source here. You have the Greek translation reorganized, and he's quoting it according to what Luke's seen. And at that point, they're together. But in other cases, like when we look at the wineskins, Matthew and Mark are together, and Luke is more independent. And in this case, Luke is more Hebraic, and Luke is talking about the aged wine. And we see Jewish parallels that talk about the wine as being Torah study, the words of the Bible in your heart, aging, being more mature. And the old wine in Ben Sira is compared to a good friend. An old friend is better than a new friend. And the new friend will be good when it's aged, like wine. You've got this type of imagery in ancient Jewish thought, early Jewish thought about the wine and Torah and friendship and these things that are very positive. But the old wine is better. That's just something that's almost universally accepted. And so when you start trying to make the new wine a little bit more as, well, Jesus is canceling the old. Maybe they thought that. I don't know. I don't know what they thought, but they kind of wanted to minimize that conclusion of the old wine is better. And I think Luke's version fits in better with the historical narrative. And linguistically, we see that being more Hebraic. But Mark is influencing Matthew. Mark and Matthew are together. I have many examples of that, where Mark is a big influence, where Matthew copies Mark. Matthew copies his sources more carefully. And many times where we see Luke and Matthew together, you can see they've got identity and wording, that they must have been copied from the same source, but Matthew is following Luke's source. So sometimes it's more Hebraic, and sometimes we see that Luke is following the first reconstruction. So it's reworded a little bit. But we see these literary sources, and we can isolate those texts and understand which text is coming from which source. And when we have a linguistic analysis, seeing the Hebraic nature of the sources and study the Jewish parallels, study the background, go into the history, understand the overall message of Jesus. You have to use the Bible to interpret the Bible. You have to use the Gospels to interpret the Gospels. And the Hebrew text itself, the Greek text itself of the Gospels, is the most precious source we have to do this type of analysis and comparative study. The text is what determines your, the evidence from the text has to determine your approach in this.
All right, let's get to the next slide. Do you want to talk a little bit about the stemma proposed by Jeremiah before we continue?
Yeah, sure. The stemma proposed by Joachim Jeremias was influential in biblical scholarship, and it's probably a stemma that's more accepted in scholarship today. And of course, there's going to be variations of this, but Joachim Jeremias was very famous for writing his book on the parables of Jesus, still one of the more influential works on the New Testament. I think one of his better books was one he wrote in German about the language of Luke. He also wrote a wonderful theology of the New Testament. He was Lutheran by background. Some people criticized him for, maybe seeing Lutheran theology a little bit more in some of these areas. But what he saw is there were complexes of tradition that were circulating. A lot of times people see this in oral sources, and that Mark wrote the first gospel. And then this Logia source, when we look at the material that is in Matthew and Luke that isn't recorded in Mark, like kind of a saying source, sayings of Jesus. Somebody even said one time it's kind of like Mao, in the Chinese Revolution, they had the Red Book of Mao's sayings, people, but they had these sayings of Jesus about discipleship. Didn't have the whole story of the Gospels, not so much the birth or the resurrection, but the sayings of Jesus. And Matthew and Luke both used the Q source, and Matthew and Luke both knew Mark. And then there was a special source of Luke. Sometimes people call this kind of a proto-Mark or something like that, but you see later. So this is the way that Joachim Jeremias, when he wrote about parables, when he wrote about the life of Jesus, he wrote a lot of articles. He also wrote a book. We talked a little bit about the New Testament apocryphal sources. He said The Unknown Sayings of Jesus, another important book where he studied extra biblical sources where they attributed sayings to Jesus. I remember Flusser, my professor David Flusser, talking about, I don't think any of these unknown sayings of Jesus could have actually been said by the known Jesus, because they're, but sometimes you have a great saying and people are trying to find a father for it, or maybe they want to give more authority to it by attributing it to Jesus. But I think we see quite a clear personality of Jesus when we study the Synoptic Gospels and the sayings. And I think it helps us to go back to some of the primary sources in rabbinic thought and literature, even a wonderful source like Pirkei Avot, chapter sayings of the fathers. Sometimes they call it the ethics of the fathers in Jewish sources. Printed usually in every Jewish prayer book and is in a tractate in the Mishnah. So it's easy to find those, but you'll see gospel parables, parallel parables, sayings, some things that might echo the ethics reflected in the teachings of Jesus as well, or in the Sermon on the Mount.
All right, so now we're talking about the cursing of the fig tree, where apparently in Luke it is more, let's see here. Luke is more original than what we see on Mark. Can you talk a little bit about this?
This is very fascinating text when we look at the cursing of the fig tree, and what we find in Luke chapter 13. We have this parable of the fig tree, that when the owner of the vineyard comes to gather fruit, he doesn't find fruit on the tree. And so he says, we're going to have to fertilize it and see if it will bear fruit. And if not, we're going to have to cut it, remove the tree. Well, this is really an ethical parable. It's a challenging parable. I like to look at the parables as what we would call an urgency to make a decision, to change your life, to take the ethical message of the kingdom and to participate in what Jesus is teaching. So in Luke, just find it here in my synopsis of the Gospels, Luke 13, 1-9, we see this parable of the fig tree. A man planted a fig tree, planted in his vineyard. He came seeking fruit on it and found none. And he said to the vine dresser, lo, these 3 years I have come seeking fruit on this fig tree. I find none. Cut it down. Why should it use up the ground? And he answered him, let it alone this year also, till I dig about it and put on manure. And if it bears fruit next year, well and good. But if not, you can cut it down. Well, this is a great challenge for spiritual renewal. You have a little bit more time to respond. Now, we have this other story where we see Jesus coming to the fig tree. It wasn't the time of fruit. There wasn't fruit. And so he cursed the fig tree. So there's some people in the interpretations of these texts that have tried to see this as maybe a symbol of Israel, that Israel is the fig tree. And in cursing of the fig tree, Jesus was cursing Israel. And I think if we look at this very carefully, look at both of these passages, they're parallel. They're not complete parallels. There's some significant differences to them. But in Jesus' teachings here, he's urging decision, possibility of spiritual renewal in Luke chapter 13. And this was an amazing miracle. The disciples saw that this fig tree dried up. But I think it would be better to see this in the larger context of the spiritual reality, where Jesus is calling everyone to a right relationship, spiritual renewal. Decision is very important in the parables and in this message that Jesus is giving. Now is the time. There's an urgency. You need to receive the message of the kingdom. Seek first the kingdom of heaven and his righteousness. All these other things will be added unto you. And I think we see that in the parables very much.
All right. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Now we're at the parable of the mustard seed and leaven.
Oh, these are very important parables. And this, of course, is a place where we have see these parables that are partner parables, parables that are reinforce one another, use the pictorial image, what we call the Bild in German, the picture that reinforces the reality. There's a picture, there's a reality behind it. These two parables, I think, are very important because probably they're the only parables that we have that are defining and explaining the kingdom for us. And what I mean by this, we have parables that tell you about aspects of the kingdom. You know, they'll say, well, the kingdom of heaven is like, but these are parables that are saying really describing the force of the kingdom. And it is a force of the mustard seed that grows and grows, and the leaven in the dough that is a force that transforms and grows and is very powerful. I think what we see in these parables is the significant growth. They're partner illustrations. They both appear in the Gospel of Thomas, but you know they have different contexts there. But these parables here, as I note in the Bible, are employed to illustrate the main theme of the parable, which is progressive growth. I think these parables were probably a little bit different than what John the Baptist would have liked, because John the Baptist seemed to feel like the kingdom or the last judgment would come very quickly. And what we see in this parable is there's a growth cycle. You know, the mustard seed talks about this miracle of a seed that when you plant it, it grows and becomes a full tree. And I don't know if when you see the mustard seed trees growing in the land of Israel today, even you're always kind of amazed. You know, they might grow in a stone wall that they'll move the stones. You know, it's a strong tree. It's not a super big tree always, but I remember there's a parallel in the Talmud that rabbi said there's a mustard seed tree and I could climb up into. I was never seen one that was that big, but they grow from a small seed. They grow into a big tree. And of course, leaven in the dough, where the woman took the leaven in the dough and it kept growing and growing. Now, leaven many times is a symbol of sin. Sa'or ba'isa, you know, that is the leaven in the dough. It can be the idea of sin. And we see this used in the New Testament by the Apostle Paul. He says a little leaven leavens the whole dough. So this is the idea of the evil inclination. On the other hand, you have to be careful because you can't just take the way a word picture is used in one parable and apply it universally to all parables, because it has to be connected to the context. And when you say the kingdom is like leaven, well, you're not saying that the leaven defines the kingdom, but there's a meaning like there's a force of evil in a man that overcomes him, and the evil within the human heart. But there's also the force of good. And there's parallels in Jewish thought that use the leaven in a very positive way. We have in the minor tractates of the Talmud the reference to peace in the earth is like leaven in the dough. Peace brings peace. When you're a man of peace, when you're a person of peace, when you're a woman, that brings peace and a strife in the family. You are causing this force of love, forgiveness, sa'or, this permeating. Another really interesting parallel, and this was one that, you know, I'm really grateful Dr. David Flusser talked to me about, helped me and see it, is parallel in the Pesikta. It's kind of a later text. It may have some earlier traditions, but they said that Bible studying the Bible was like leaven in the dough. They said, even if you sin, even if you completely depart from everything that's godly, if you just keep studying the Bible, the leaven that's in it is so powerful that it'll bring you into a right relationship with God, bring you into a force of repentance. I think that's the reason Jesus was using the leaven. He's using it as a force. The kingdom is a force. If you forgive, it releases this force of forgiveness. If you do something to help someone that's in financial problem, you're releasing this force of the kingdom: forgiveness, healing, love, love those that hate you, turn the other cheek, go the second mile. These principles laid out in the Sermon on the Mount, very challenging, but that is the force of God's kingdom. You have a partnership with God. The kingdom comes from God alone. It's not something that a person brings, but you are able to participate and cooperate with it. Same way with the mustard seed. It grows and grows. So there's a progressive growth of the kingdom. Now, there are some people that tried to challenge this idea of growth in the kingdom with saying it's a small beginning and the great end. Johannes Weiss, other fine scholars. But I think really when you look at that, there's a progressive growth. I think a similar idea, I think, especially if we would just compare it to John the Baptist, might be in the tares among the wheat. Now, the parable of the tares among the wheat deal with the final judgment. But it says, we plant good seed in our field. An enemy came in, planted tares, the bad seed. They start growing. Well, the tares take the nutrients away from the wheat. And so one thing you might want to do is just go up and pull up the tares. But if you pull up the tares, you'll pull up the wheat. And so the owner of the field is telling the workers, well, let them grow up. And at the harvest, we'll cut them and separate the tares from the wheat. There'll be a great separation. The tares will be burned. The wheat will be gathered into the barn. And so what I think we see here is not the imagery that John the Baptist used in the first chapters of the Gospels of an immediate judgment where the axe is laid to the root and there's the burning and the outpouring of the Holy Spirit on the righteous, the burning of the wicked, in this terrible judgment scene that is calling for repentance immediate. But there's a growth period where the tares are mixed into the wheat. So this is kind of portraying a time of evil and good existing together, fighting together, but the force of the kingdom is overcoming. And again, I think what we see in the teachings of Jesus is this call to decision, that you can determine what's going to happen to you by making the right decision now. This is the time. This is the day of salvation. Make the decision. And the kingdom is something that we see growing in power and force today in our lives. And so it's a little different from the way that John the Baptist was describing. I mean, I think the difference between John the Baptist and Jesus was the kingdom message. And the kingdom of progressive growth with the parables is a little different from the idea that John the Baptist had, where he's kind of connecting the last judgment with this establishment, finally, of the sovereignty of God in all time.
We just have a couple more slides left. I want to talk about the Great Omission. Much of the material in Mark 6:45 to 8:26 has no parallel material in the Gospel of Luke, but does have parallel material in the Gospel of Matthew.
I think this is really important, because when people start with this premise that Luke is copying Mark, they have this view sometimes that, well, you would never shorten Gospels. For instance, Mark is what you would say, shorter. So again, it's kind of like the argument of order. Since it's shorter, it appears like the other Gospels are expanding on him. But I think this shows what I was trying to say in the book when I'm writing that, is that this shows the independence of Luke, and that Luke is more original. And it shows us a little bit how Mark can delete things. Mark can rewrite a little bit. He can rework a story. And, we shouldn't think that somebody wouldn't want to shorten it. I feel like when I'm reading Mark, I can see that, sometimes he makes reference to a longer teaching of Jesus in Matthew or Luke, but he's shortening it. He doesn't give parables. He has 4 parables. He has one parable that's not in either of the Gospels, but, the fact that he knew the other parables, I think he probably just wanted to emphasize in his story of Jesus' life the miracles. He's the holy man who works miracles, who goes from place to place. he doesn't have time to eat. He's stressing these aspects of Jesus' life and ministry that aren't quite as pronounced in Matthew or Luke, but he can admit something. So, to me, this is an argument. You can argue it either way. I mean, but the way I'm reading it with together with all the evidence we're talking about the synoptic problem, this indicates again that Luke was before Mark.
I want to go over some of the things that's in that great omission. Jesus walking on water, Jesus in the region of the Gennesaret. The Pharisees argued the clean and the unclean thing, and the faith of the Syro-Phoenician woman, the trip through Sidon and the Decapolis, the healing of the deaf and the mute man, Jesus feeds the 4,000, the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod, the healing of a blind man at Bethsaida. So, is this great omission? What is your take on this? Did Mark make all that stuff up, or did he get that? Did he get that from other sources? Does Luke not have that stuff because Mark created it, and Matthew has that stuff because he got it from Mark? What happened?
Well, some parts of it you can see is that, like the tradition of the elders, Matthew is citing it. Part of it, I think Matthew is taking more from the reorganized text. Part of it, Mark is taking from there, but Luke admitted it, and he didn't take it from those sources. But there are very important sources in this gospel, and Luke, is using these two sources: the Greek, the reorganized text, the first reconstruction, and he didn't select those passages in there, but Matthew is getting it from Mark, and Mark is getting it from this reorganized text. And those are important stories in the life of Jesus. I'm not trying to say they're secondary. I'm saying that they come from they have some roots in the Hebrew or evangelium, and I see Matthew being a better representation of that again. And I think that would be the key, I would say, when we're looking at the synoptic gospels, is that, we've got to give a lot of authority to Matthew and Luke. And we do have a lot of authority to Mark, but Mark is a little bit more freer in the way that he's keeping his sources. For instance, of course, this is probably... I'm starting to say something. I'll just complete this thought. I hope I'm not providing this, but one of these sources is really important in Mark 7:19 that I think helps people understand some of this in this passage, where you're talking about the tradition of the elders and the Mark 7:19, and then you've got Matthew 15. Maybe I'll look at in my synopsis of the Gospels, because we have this translation where they are saying that you're canceling the commandments of God by your tradition. And there's the tradition of the elders, and there's the commandment of God. And what's very fascinating about this is that, Jesus is saying it's what's on the inside that pollutes, not the outside of the cup. And sometimes people read this like, no, nobody in Jewish thought it this way. But actually, Jesus is citing the traditional halakha. And then they make this very interesting conclusion in the translations of Mark 7:19. He says, well, what enters into his heart, what comes into the man, doesn't enter into his heart, but it goes through his stomach and passes out of the body. And then they say, thus he declared all foods clean. Well, this is a participle. I mean, he did not make it, never says, thus he declared. This is something that's added by translators for clarification. And it makes it sound like the tradition of the elders are the kosher laws and that Jesus was canceling all dietary restrictions. And Matthew doesn't have, Matthew's text is different. I think Matthew's text probably reflects better the Hebrew gospel. But one of the things I think is really important in understanding this is that when it says in the Greek text, you can see it very clearly, at least in my mind, it's very clearly, he says, what goes in, he's talking about the purity of the heart. He's not talking about kosher food. He's talking about your heart being pure. If your heart has adultery or murder or stealing, lust, it's what purifies it. It's not what's outside. It's not outside the cup that causes impurity. It's what's on the inside, and it's what's on the inside of the heart. And this is what he's emphasizing all through this teaching. But when they translated it, they come to this phrase where it passes out. It goes through his stomach and passes out. Right after that, there's a present active nominative participle, purifying, it says, all food. It doesn't say he said purify. It says when it passes through your system, all the food is pure. It goes out. It's purifying all the food as it goes through your body. And I don't see how you can translate it any other way. It's purifying all the food as it's going out of your body. So in our Hebrew Heritage Bible translation, I think we had a better translation. And there's a lot of other translations that reflect this. But it's probably a good idea to talk about this here because, again, it's something where we're kind of making the Jesus of the Gospels more antithetical to the Jewish faith and practice of the time. I would imagine that Jesus, his disciples, and most of the believing, faithful Jewish people that are listening to this are, keeping kosher food, and they're not even thinking about a ham and cheese sandwich. When he's talking about that, he's talking about the purity of the heart. So, in the Hebrew Heritage Bible in Mark chapter 7, we'll start in verse 18. So he asked them, how is it that you yourselves fail to understand? Do you not grasp the teaching that whatever goes inside the individual from the outside cannot cause defilement because it does not go into the person's heart, but only into the individual stomach where it passes through a natural process purifying all foods and is eliminated into the sewer. It passes through the body, it's purifying through that sense. But it's amazing to me how some translations have tried to make that a statement that I'm canceling kosher food or something. It's not, kosher food is not even in the radar of what they're talking about. It's a question of ritual purity. There are some people that said ritual purity was transferred from the outside of the cup. The dominant view was no, ritual purity is from what's on the inside of the cup. So he's illustrating this, that you need to have a pure heart. He's not talking about a ham and cheese sandwich. But at any rate, but these are great parts of this admission. But I think it shows you the good tradition. David Flusser, I would say, when we look at the stemma, he always had this sensitivity to Mark, and he had some good sources, oral tradition, and Matthew too. But I still think that the fact that we have this great admission from Luke is kind of an indication, with all the evidence put together, that Luke is earlier than Mark. But they have some good traditions for the life of Jesus. Matthew had special sources that we talk about, I think, in the birth narratives that maybe Luke didn't know. Luke had some very important sources, his special sources about the birth narratives as well. And they have some different sources, oral traditions. I think a lot of their material is this Hebrew reorganized gospel, and some of them are using it in different ways, but I think we can see those traditions going up in there. And there's some Hebraic, and it's very, we have these kind of arguments a lot within the rabbinic literature. Somebody said, I think it recently, Professor Gutman, who's written a lot, but he says the essence of Judaism. I heard him in Hebrew talking about this, but I like it. He says it's a machloket. The essence of the Hebrew Jewish faith is a discussion and argument. Now, there are arguments for the sake of heaven that are really important, and there are arguments that are not for the sake of heaven. But sometimes when you're asking, how do we observe Sabbath properly? How do we observe it Passover? Well, there's different views on how you interpret the basic laws. So this is a part of the whole discussion. But here, Jesus is really dealing with the heart issue, and translators, I think, have, contrary to the evidence and contrary to the Greek text, are introducing a new thing that just seems to come out of nowhere and make no sense out of it, But if we look at the text a little bit more, think about Hebraically what's being said, it's good. But I think there's really important sources in that great admission. There's no doubt about it. And they come from good sources. And but Luke didn't use it. Luke didn't use it.
All right, we're at the final slide, the Beatitudes. So we're going to go over this just for a moment. So Matthew talks about blessed are the poor in spirit, whereas Luke renders it blessed are you poor. I remember you talking about in the book, you say that blessed are the poor in spirit in Matthew is actually more original than Luke's, and it connects better with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Very important question. Many people feel like, there's been authors and fine scholars, and sometimes you give a little critical review of even the fine scholars who felt like, since Luke talks about the poor in a social sense, it fits in more with the social gospel, and they felt like that's more original. But I tend to disagree that, Luke's version of the Beatitudes, I would see coming from this reorganized text. And it's quite a bit different from Matthew's text. And I think Matthew is better reflecting the Hebrew ontology, this earlier source. And when we see the Anye Ruach, the poor in spirit, Pneumati in Greek, when you see that, it doesn't sound very good in Greek. What kind of dative is that? How do you understand it, poor, in relation to spirit? I think we translated it in the Newer Testament, the poor who know their need for the spirit. There's a lot in the rabbinic literature that looks at the spirit as humble of spirit as someone that has humility, has a hunger, a yearning for a spiritual life, looking up to the Lord. And when we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, we didn't have a parallel to this, but in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found a parallel in the War Scroll where the Anye Ruach were referring back to the members of their community who were thought to be humble servants of God, seeking the Spirit in their lives. And we also found another parallel in the Psalm Scroll. I think we also find parallels in the book of Isaiah. Not complete. Now, let me say, the parallels we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls are exact linguistic connections. This is what I've been saying earlier, is that sometimes we have a Greek idiom that it doesn't sound right in Greek. It just doesn't sound right. But when we begin to study some of the Hebrew of the time, here we have the exact same phrase. And it's kind of a word to say, this is how we describe the community. They're humble, they're yearning for God. And we can also see a larger biblical text, Isaiah 65, 64, those who are seeking the Lord, they tremble before God. They're the humble of the earth. you've got some of these phrases in the prophet Isaiah. We also have some phrases similar in the Psalms that show this attitude towards life. Psalm 37, Psalm 34, Psalm 51. I love that passage. Renew a right spirit within me. And really, when we look at the Beatitudes and we look at the commentary in the Dead Sea Scrolls on Psalm 37, where it says, who will inherit the earth? The poor will inherit the earth. Now, the word poor and the word humble are very similar in Hebrew. It's a yod and a vav. The yod is just a little longer vav. So sometimes we see anve, anye, ruach, the poor in spirit, the humble of the earth. Shafal ruach is another term that we use in Hebrew sometimes, which is a little different word, lowering yourself. But it's exalting humility. It's exalting meekness. I think in our translations, we usually say the meek will inherit the earth. And so the Dead Sea community wrote a commentary on the meek will inherit the earth. And it emphasized these characteristics, these attributes in your personality, your lifestyle, your orientation to how you treat other people, how you pray to God, is that you're humble, you're reaching out to God, and you're recognizing your need for the Spirit. It's a great emphasis on the Spirit. And of course, we have many references in this when we get into the book of Acts and even the letters of the Apostle Paul of the spiritual aspect, the pneumatology. When the Apostle Paul talks about the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, long-suffering, these are things that are produced by a spiritual transformation from within. I think it really goes with what we're talking about earlier, that it's what's in the heart that's important, not so much what is outward. So, and this word ashrei, blessed, it is showing this acceptance by God. This it's so much more than happy. Some people say, well, you're just happy, it's good for you. But ashrei has a meaning of your steps too, how your steps are guided, and that you're in the state of this acceptance, walking in the right path, and you are entering into this relationship. And so if we look at that, Ashrei Anyei Ruach Ki Mehem Malchut Shemaim, as we translate into Hebrew, blessed are the poor in spirit, for from these is the kingdom of heaven. Like the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's a term that Jesus was using to define his community of disciples. They are poor in what is related to spirit. They are poor knowing their need for their spirit, their yearning for the Spirit, and they don't own the kingdom of heaven. There's what we call the partitive genitive and what we call the possessive genitive. Well, the genitive, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That's the possessive genitive, like you own the kingdom of heaven. But that's not the right genitive. You should understand this as Mehem Malchut Shemaim. They are a part of the kingdom. If you're in the disciples of Jesus in the Spirit, poor in spirit that know their need for the Spirit, then you are making up the kingdom. You become this force for what? Showing mercy, having forgiveness. You look at all these things, hungering and thirsting for righteousness. So, you have these 7 Beatitudes that and you have the 8th if you talk about the persecution that comes at the end. Now Luke, I think his version is a little bit different, and I believe it would probably be coming from that first reconstruction. It also have the woes, it makes it a little more sociological, and those that laugh now, you will mourn. It kind of balances out a little bit, maybe a little bit different version. But in my opinion, when we look at Matthew's text, like we've seen before in our analysis of our sources behind the Gospels, his source is probably representing the first analogy, the first anthology that we see of the text coming out for it. But this is a very important passage in the Beatitudes. I know David Flusser in the journal Emmanuel that was published for many years through the Ecumenical Theological Research Fraternity. They have, he wrote an article about the poor in spirit. It's very, very helpful, and showed a lot of the connections to Isaiah, the prophets, the Psalms. And, it's amazing when we get to the Dead Sea Scrolls and we start reading these Psalm scrolls and the spiritual life and the things that they were extolling, the attributes, the characteristics that would bring wholeness and healing to a suffering world that we read in these manuscripts. And I mean there's aspects of the Dead Sea Scroll community, these things that we don't really ascribe to, that we feel like they were kind of emphasizing some aspects of judgment and self-righteousness a little bit for their own community that we don't like. But I think what we see with Jesus, he's a little closer to Hillel, Yochanan ben Zakkai, and this whole big umbrella that's reaching out in the kingdom. I remember how the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King inspired so many by talking about the beloved community, that he would see. I think, King was schooled in the teachings of Jesus, and, that impacted him a lot. This idea, because he went to Israel and, had a great relationship with Abraham, Joshua, Heschel. I think all those things are part of his legacy, but the beloved community. And so he wasn't quite like the Dead Sea community, who are kind of more, egalitarian. They were more looking at their sect as being the only possible good, and they looked very negatively at other Jews at the time and other, especially with their own space. Jesus seems to be talking about the kingdom and a force that would bring healing and justice and wholeness to the world as he's proclaiming it, that you would get right with God now. Now is the time. The kingdom of God is for you today. But I think you see that in the community. Blessed are the poor in spirit. These are the Anyei Ruach. It's so beautiful in Hebrew. And then when you find it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you see it used in a similar way about Psalm 37, about this force for good. And so they make up the kingdom of heaven. So you can be a force of good within the kingdom of heaven, is what he's saying, more than you own it. Nobody owns the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is God's sovereignty alone. So I think getting the partitive idea, and Jesus uses that sometimes, for such is the kingdom of heaven. For such as these are in the kingdom. Be as a child, for such as these. As a little child is what make up the kingdom.
And does the Dead Sea Scrolls, does any of the scrolls specifically say, "Blessed are the poor in spirit"? Is there any exact identical phrase to that, or not quite?
No, it doesn't say blessed. It's not a beatitude, but it uses the term poor in spirit itself. And, I think not quite as close a parallel to it is the reference to the commentary on Psalm 37. See if I might have it written down real handy here. I'm quoting it from heart, but I think I could get you the more precise wording very quickly. But it doesn't say blessed. There are parts of the scrolls that talk, you can talk about blessing and the different aspects of it. But the Pesher on the interpretation commentary on Psalms 37 is one that I like, that is similar. It doesn't use the exact phrase, but it says V'kovei Adonai Hema Yershu Aretz. Those who are hoping in the Lord, they are those who will inherit the earth. Now, in the Psalm scroll, let's see, I think I have it written down here someplace. Let's see, Hodayot chapter 38, it says to proclaim your good, to speak good news to the humble in your great mercy. And it talks about Vanye Ruach. It talks about from the reach of the Anye Ruach, which is Nakei Ruach, is kind of like this in the same frame as Anye Ruach. And then also in the War Scroll, let's see if I have it here in the War Scroll someplace. I think it's chapter 14 of the War Scroll. It has also the idea, the Anye Ruach, but it's identifying the Anye Ruach or Nakei Ruach, Anye Ruach, as the poor in spirit as well, So, and you have the hoping in the words. But, it's very amazing when you have this exact phrase. And we have several things, similar phrases in the Hebrew scripture, but not the exact phrase.
And in my final question, from which one of those sources did Matthew acquire "Blessed are the poor in spirit"?
From the anthology.
I'd like to remind everybody real quick before we close, I'll have the link to Brad Young's book, Jesus and His Jewish Parables, in the description below, and also in the pinned comment. I'll also have a link to the Jerusalem School website down there, Brad Young's website. That being said, thank you for joining me today, Brad.
Thank you so much, Jacob. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you again.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.